Thanks for coming tonight. This should be very interesting. I'm actually, for a man who needs no introduction, it's a little odd. Eric gets 2 introductions tonight. I'm actually only introducing the man who will introduce Eric Owen Moss, who you may know. He spends time here in the school. Hernan will be doing the real introduction. This is the fake introduction. I think I'm only your second, because if I mess this up, you can make up for it, I imagine. The other thing is that I might be here to try and humanize Eric Owen Moss. Maybe I'm the non-architect who gets to make Eric Owen Moss into a human being instead of an architect. But I don't think that's possible. And I don't think it's possible, not because you're not a human being, but because to separate you from architecture and just turn you into a regular human being doesn't make any sense at all. Eric, I don't have to tell you, I think you all know Eric. Eric is consumed by architecture. Eric is obsessed with architecture. He's someone who believes that everything architecture is and is related to is important, and everything is related to architecture. So it's my pleasure to introduce the man who will introduce Eric Owen Moss. Here at SCI-Arc, we're the beneficiaries of Eric's obsession. It's seen here on every wall in this building. I'm the beneficiary of Eric's obsession. In so many ways, in fact, I don't think I'd be here in any capacity if it were not for Eric Owen Moss. It's been said by press and other people that Eric has an overflowing repository of cultural references, each part equal in deep insight and ADD. In conversation, his tangents have tangents. I see that, but I think that's almost a parody of what Eric is. It's true, but ultimately he's, I think, a lot more simple than that. What he himself says is stuff like, you don't know, we don't know, we might know, we should try to know. He gets comfort in a context of intrinsic uncomfortableness. That's what makes him different. I saw him ask a question and then question the nature of the question. It ended up becoming something that changed the way I look at everything in architecture and even in real estate. He has said your job, students, and I guess faculty as well, is not necessarily to solve a problem, but to make a problem, one that may not be solvable. I, as a developer, find that a little annoying and actually difficult to deal with, but that's the nature of Eric, I think. His resume is a long and distinguished one. He has an incredible body of work and an incredible amount of time that he has spent teaching others about that work. But that's not really how I know him. I can only tell you about him from what I saw in the last 15 years while I've known Eric. I saw him take on the tumultuous, unsteady, and unsure SCI-Arc in 2002. He led and guided it as no one believed possible. In the end, he delivered SCI-Arc and delivered a SCI-Arc that remained pedagogically intact, financially more secure and sustainable than ever in its history. He led the school not by promoting any particular doctrine, but rather through the force of his irreverence and his ethics. Faculties and students were given freedom, but then immense responsibility to act and develop their own points of view. I personally saw him drive the purchase of this building. I saw him do it when no one else thought we could get around to finally buying this thing. He changed it. He was like a dog with a bone when he tried to get this building from the original developers. And for that alone, he deserves our thanks and applause. I saw him reach into the world of developers and bankers and politicians, no small task, and he learned to speak their language without losing his own voice, which was incredible. I saw him compromise. I saw Eric Moss compromise. I saw him do it when we were working on the building north of here, and he had to deal with the Los Angeles Conservancy, a great organization, but not exactly Eric's cup of tea. And the Los Angeles Conservancy and Eric started out here and here, and then over the course of months and months and months found something that not only would they agree with, but would support in front of City Council, and that was a great testament to what he could do. I saw him surround himself with voices every bit as strong as his and engage them as the happy warrior, alternating between his Don Quixote and his Sancho Panza, tilting at windmills and giants alike. I saw him carve his list of fellow mischief makers into the walls of SCI-Arc: Lebbeus Woods, Raymond Abraham, Peter Noever, and of course Wolf and Tom. I saw his dedication to them and their voices, making sure SCI-Arc would never forget them, his uncomfortable friends. I saw his astounding lecture, The Man from the Country Where No One Else Lives, last year. Who saw that lecture? Did you see this lecture? Nobody saw this lecture last year? Jesus. Get on SCI-Arc's website, go to lectures, go to Eric's lecture, because it's astounding. And I saw in that the full spectrum of the architect, the genius, and the poet that is Eric Moss. Moss embraced the challenge not to confuse technical means with poetic ends and brought us all along for the ride. I saw him change while he was here. Yes, Eric, I did. I saw you change. He changed from instigator to teacher to leader and ultimately to conscience, and now remains the instigator. He's come full circle, back where he belongs. Near the end of T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, the book Moss was reportedly reading the day his client Frederick Smith first stopped in his office, is a phrase that sounds just like Eric. We shall not cease from exploration, and at the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Now, as I see him contemplating his next phase, I see him getting more and more comfortable with being uncomfortable. Thanks for that, Eric. Cheers. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the man who will introduce the man of whom we speak, another director with three names, Hernan Diaz Alonso.
Thank you, Tom, for that, and for everything else, and you and the rest of the board. That's for the school. You will see that even though Tom and I, we didn't coordinate, there's going to be some common grounds on this introduction. I just realized that we shouldn't have 6 or 7 introductions, so we will reduce Eric's talk to 5 minutes, and that wouldn't be something to see. But I'm speedballing here, so stay with me. First, before I get to the formal introduction of the guy who the name's on the wall, I want to have like a 20 seconds touchy, feely-feeling thing, which is very unusual for me. I'm incredibly thankful for Eric for all these years of friendship and mentorship and many other personal things. I'm not going to go into it, and I want to say that at least once publicly. I come from a family and a tradition that we don't talk about those things, so that will be the only time I will say that in the months to come, but I wanted to say once at least. Now, Eric Owen Moss. As you can imagine, for somebody who does the most convoluted, obscure, and difficult introductions that anybody in this world will ever heard, it's a difficult task to do. So, for a man of simple taste like myself, I thought it would be easy to start to tackle certain basic ideas. So, one simple thing was, his last name has a lot of interesting riff when you put in this sequencing. And if you go and do the basic thing, which is to check what they mean, a body of coherent matter, usually on indefinite shape and often of considerable size. We don't know if we'll be talking about his buildings, himself, his ego, his attitude, but one thing Tom mentioned, I have the pleasure to never seen Eric compromise, and to me that's a great thing. Mess, I think that word will fit really, really well in many, many aspects. I don't know how to say the second word, so a dirty, untidy, or disordered condition. Again, it's not clear what we're talking about here. Miss, to feel, to hit or strike, to miss a target, to fail to take advantage of, to miss a chance. I don't think that he missed that much, but when he does, I think he does it on purpose. And that also is an interesting thing to think about. Moss, what it means, verb used with object, to cover with the growth of moss, to moss a crumbling wall. It's basically when a lot of crap goes on top of something. But also I think you can say Eric Owen for the Latin musum, who means I really don't know. It's not I don't know, it means that in Latin. And mus, which I think is a very interesting one, a state of disorder of untidiness, verb used with object, to put in disorder, make it messy, rumple, often followed by up. Now, the other thing which I want to touch, which is a very complicated and convoluted sideway to what I really want to say, is that if you take one S out and you say mus, mus is a Spanish card game, which was my father's favorite game. It's a Spanish game and played also in Hispanic American. It's basically a game that you go for either to win or to lose, and you have to announce it before you do it. But the other interesting thing, the mus card game was invented in the same century that Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra wrote Don Quixote de la Mancha, which already Tom touched on this. And the reason we're touching on this is because we hear him so many times to invoke Don Quixote de la Mancha. And I thought, as somebody who is Argentinian and the son of a Spanish person, that I thought it would be good to, not to set the record straight, but to clarify certain things about Don Quixote de la Mancha, which if you don't read Spanish, I'm not so sure you will fully understand. But the other thing which is interesting is, it's a cultural endeavor. It's not just a book, it's not just a character, it's not just a writer. It symbolizes centuries of a culture and embodies many read of it. So there are many Don Quixotes. The Don Quixote that Miguel Cervantes Saavedra wrote, but also there are the Don Quixote paintings from Picasso to the ones in the middle on the right, to the different actors that they played Don Quixotes along the years. So there are many Don Quixotes, there are many ways to think about this, and if you look at some of the texts, there is a clear reason why Eric, I think, likes to quote and often refer to Don Quixote. And the one I choose, you can read, I'm not gonna read all the way, but basically it's the most obvious and known one, what Sancho Panza asked were giants, the one that you can see over there. And Sancho says, of course they're not giants. Everybody knows the story. And at the end, this is the cool part. Obviously, this replies Don Quixote. You don't know that much about adventures. Now, there are many Don Quixotes. There are many Eric Owen Moss. And in a way, actually, the Don Quixote that I think it comes close to Don Quixote is the one that Terry Gilliam tried to do in 2000. Who could never finish. If anybody knows the story of the movie, everything that could go wrong, went wrong. The main actor, Ranch Rochford, died in the middle. All the problems that you can think he has, but Terry Gilliam keep insisting and doing it and doing it and doing it. And at the end, it became a documentary called Lost in La Mancha. And because the movie didn't happen, but the documentary happened about the movie, it became the perfect representation of what Don Quixote is. The separation between the fiction of the construction of the fiction and the reality of the complexity that such an endeavor produced. And in a strange way, Lost in La Mancha became the most precise definition of Don Quixote. And in a way, one could argue that it's a perfect metaphor for the act of architecture, which is, you know that everything that can go wrong will go wrong, but it will not deviate from your passion, and eventually you can make a different story about that adventure. So I took a quote of the many things that you can find of Eric on the website, but I think this one is a powerful one when you said, I don't think you move the discussion of architecture, you're so happy, and everything in the world is working. Because then, if everything is functioning, then you tend to continue to do what you will do anyway. I think you have to be disappointed, frustrated, or angry. You have to see the world could be something other than it is, different than that it is, and that you also have to think you can make it go somewhere else. Whether it's for better or for worse is a more philosophical discussion, and I think that was what makes people change things. regardless if it's writing something like you do, or composing an opera, or writing a work of something, it has to be different. Now, in all these years I've been in this game in one way or another, I never met anybody more committed to that idea. And I think it's our treasure and joy that we have him here. So one last thing I would like to say, Eric Owen Moss is never lost for words, but he's always in La Mancha, which is this weird state between reality, fiction, what it is, and what it could be. So I will not tell you to join me to welcome to Eric in SCI-Arc, because Eric is in SCI-Arc, and Eric in many ways is SCI-Arc. So, Eric, your turn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gilmore. Very kind and generous and slightly sentimental, which is not your way, to say nothing of Hernan. Qualities unseen and unrecognized. So thank you very much. I appreciate all of that. I'm the enemy, in case you didn't know, or in case you missed it in the introduction. I think, as was pointed out, I've said that, and I've said it on a number of occasions, and the meaning of I'm the enemy, I think, is important to mention, at least briefly. The culture has its rules, the culture has its pro forma, the culture has its methods and its systems, and when you arrive, and most of the people that are sitting here are students or young students, you arrive to a context which exists a priori. You arrive to a context which is defined and organized and systematized. And I think the job is to resist that, to counter it, to contest it. That's the job of the architect, and that's the enemy. The culture, the defined culture, is the enemy. But the second enemy is a little bit more insidious, and the more I stand here and tell you who the enemy is and pontificate and explain, the more you have to wonder whether I'm not the character that I'm advising you to watch out for. Because the more I claim to know, and the more I feel that I understand, and the more I've worked over a period of time to the point where I think, at one point, I didn't know, or wasn't clear, or didn't understand, but now I've done it, I've redone it, I'm comfortable with it, and that leads, I think, to a conceptual complacency. So I think what I have to do is both follow the conviction that I have and simultaneously be suspicious of it, mistrust it. Otherwise, I become the target that I'm admonishing you to watch out for. Whoa. This is a quote that says a similar, or delivers a similar message in slightly different words. Rice pudding stuck in the microwave and comes out macaroni. And I think what it has to do with is what we know, or what we think we know. And knowing means the capacity to predict, to understand and to predict, so we know how the world works and we know where it will go. There's another possibility, which is that as you learn and as you go forward, you actually unlearn, so that in the end, it's at least hypothetically possible that the conclusions you arrive at are different than the conclusions you started with, and the sum total of knowledge doesn't grow, but it simply changes. And so whether this is literally true or not, or an aspiration or a metaphor, the prospect that what could come out is not what you anticipated coming out, but a very different possibility. A friend gave me this recently. This is the cover of Charlie Hebdo, the first cover that arrived following the killings in Paris several months ago. And I associate not the heroism of the writers and artists who work there, but with an aspiration in architecture. It has something to do with conviction, it has something to do with tenacity, it has something to do with resilience. All of those essential in the face of resistance, in the face of opposition, in the face of those in a tyrannical way, in a cultural way, in a political way, who will attempt to cover the earth with concrete, because they always do, and they always will. But for those of you who work with concrete, the concrete always cracks, and out of the cracks come the resistance. That's you guys in the front row, that's me. Out of the cracks, they cover the world with concrete, it cracks, we come out of the cracks. This has to do with a different problem that I think in one form or another we all have. A philosophical problem and more deeply an existential problem. And starting on the left, Dürer, which is early in the 16th century, which is a woodcut of the apocalypse. I've shown it here before, so you know it, and you know the story of war, famine, pestilence, and death comes from Revelation. But what's interesting to me in this context is that it's a story, and it's a shared story. So if you put that woodcut, which is extraordinary, up on a wall in northern Germany at the beginning of the 16th century, whether people read it or not, or read Revelation or could read it, they know the story, they relate to the story, they connect with the story. It's a shared meaning. Now dial it up 400 years and you got Juan Gris, in this case, Gris, Braque, and Picasso. And now we run into a somewhat different problem, which is sustained, I think, to this day, which is a privatization of content. And that means it's no longer a shared story. It means it's a more private and personal and idiosyncratic story. And what that brings with it are critics and evaluators and tastemakers and interpreters and all of that, because the work is not generally shared, the meanings aren't collectively understood, so we'll turn to science, because surely science and technology that you all know and love will give us an underpinning and a foundation and a premise, and from that we can go forward knowing we can count on that. So this is Phobos, the twin of Deimos, known as the steeds of Mars. There are ideas about the forms of heavenly bodies. They have a certain shape, they go in a certain direction. These are the wrong shape, and they go in the wrong direction. So maybe science isn't the shared story either. This is one we discussed last week, Lucian Freud, work on the left, with the comment that all art or all essential art is autobiographical. And the burden of that, which is illustrated in the image. And the question is architecture, or can the architecture that comes from me be understood as personal and autobiographical? And I think it is, and I think it can be. And this is, for instance, for you, it's a project about 20 years old. Some of you know it. The original model was made out of a lemon rind that was lying on a desk, so it had a curvilinear quality. The transformation of that in the built object was a series of 1,000 concrete blocks, everyone the same, everyone different, but the transition from something which is curvilinear and smooth to something which was incremental and essentially orthogonal is important. And I think the characteristics of this, if I were looking at Lucian Freud, looking back in a mirror. It's rough, it's uneven, it has uncertainty mixed with conviction. It's crude in some ways, and I think the objective is that by the end of the process, we'll understand how to do it, at which point we probably will take a look at another option. This, as an underpinning for the work, has also to do with the evolution of content in literature, in music, and in architecture, and the most unusual work, the most personal work, the most investigatory work, the most imaginative work consistently has to do with these interrogatories. What is literature? What is music? What is architecture? And on the left is a map, some of you may know it, of Finnegan's Wake, which is not only a literal map and mapping itself related to modeling and predicting and understanding, but this is a map in the context of literature, which is not only geography, but psychology within Finnegan's Wake. The second one from the left, John Cage raises a completely different area of interest. Essentially, what is music and or what is sound, and is music only auditory? If you've listened to Cage, you might debate whether it's auditory at all, but what it also is visual, it's aesthetic, so that music is not only what you hear, it's what you see. So this is a new vantage point on what music might be, and then all of you will, or many of you, recognize Giuseppe Torragni in the Danteum, which is essentially Dante's Divine Comedy and journey from hell to paradise via purgatory, and the intersection of a journey, a literary journey, transformed as architecture. So the lack of definition, or the unwillingness to accept the limit or an a priori limit as criteria for what makes an art form, is essential to making it again. The two quotes, one on the left, one on the right, and this comes, by the way, from a film called The Wind, which was made in 1928 by a Swedish director called Victor Seaström. And the comment that it's relatively easy and we have a lot of success adjusting to circumstances. So what does that mean? I mean, if it rains and I put up an umbrella and a coat and a hat, I'm adjusting to circumstances, let's say. If it's windy and I put on the same coat and hat, I'm adjusting to circumstance. If we redefine the meaning of the wind, if we say the wind is a horse in the sky, and by the way, this is as filmmaking goes, 1928, which is a pretty sophisticated piece. So now we've made the subject into something, we've metamorphosized the subject. The metaphor is different, and we've said the wind is not the wind and we'll accommodate it with a coat and a hat. We're saying the wind is a horse in the sky. To do that, in other words, to make the circumstance, to invent the circumstance instead of accommodating the circumstance, would be the aspiration. This gets heavy, or heavier. The drawing, Blake's drawing, you know, it has an antecedent in Proverbs, and the question that he asks is, who is God, or what is God? And the ordering mechanism that somewhere in the discourse of architecture, whether fractals or Euclid, has something to do with geometry, and the compass, which connotes that, and other investigations that don't so much say this is geometry, but say, what is geometry? Rothko or Rothko on the left, unboxing the box on the right. My dad was a writer, and I can remember when he wasn't writing, he was making lists. And he used to make lists of words and the interrelationship of words, their sounds, their rhyme, their meanings. And every time I do a lecture, and there have been lots of these in probably the last 4 or 5 years, I've shown this list, which has no beginning, which has no end, but which is added to and subtracted from as my father did. So this is my list. Hernan looked at this and said, Moss, you can't make anything pretty. But he was wrong. There's a second sequence of buildings that I want to run in just a second. And for those of you who have worked on many projects and tend to think of buildings qua buildings, or building begins and ends, and then another building comes and begins and ends, and another building comes and begins and ends. And for a long time, I've thought about that process as an aggregate process, which means the buildings are not only buildings per se, but pieces of buildings, and that if we added the pieces in the aggregate, that we would get conceivably a single work. And that work also is ongoing, so you don't get to the end of it. very quickly, I think I'm way behind here. I want to talk about two projects that have to do with a collision with time in a very particular way. Certainly the topic of architecture and the durability of architecture and the intersection of time present. I think Gilmore mentioned that Eliot piece, time past, time present, and time future. And when you work on a project which pieces have to remain, like working on a piece of paper where you can erase certain things, but you can't erase everything. And the intersection, I think, of what is contemporary and what is the future is liable to be violent. You have to move the present out of the way in order to insert the future. This is a little bit different conceptually from working on something which is entirely new, because it obligates you to make certain choices, what to stay, what of the past stays, what of the present stays, and how to move the present out of the way and accommodate the future. This is a project a couple of years ago at the Angewandte in Vienna. This is the Danube Canal and 3 existing buildings, 19th century and 2 in the 20th century, a courtyard in the middle, and the Museum of Angewandte Kunst sitting there in the middle. The metaphor for this, which has been talked about a bit, I think, were the birds on the wire, which is simply a sense of kinetic, in my interpretation, had to do with the 19th century and the 20th century, certainly as static, and what was inserted as in motion, and the kinetic insertion would be these birds on a wire. And you can follow on the right the chronology, the structure, the birds. The second project is a current one and is a remarkable and a wonderful opportunity for an architect in a city which is in some ways a quintessential city for architecture. Barcelona, and this is the Térmica, which has a long history. I give it to you in a concise way. It's a power plant that was designed and built in 1970, fossil fuels, and ran through 2010 and was terminated, finished. And in the process of remaking the seaside, the Mediterranean Sea, Barcelona adjacent, this project, it was determined, would become something else, which raises a whole series of questions again in terms of what stays and what's removed and why. But it is already, at this point, iconic. It's the biggest building in Barcelona, so it'll be amended, it'll be added to, but in a fundamental way, it won't come down. The other fascinating issue in this, for me, has to do with whether it's a bromide or not, I'm not so sure, but the old discourse about the interrelationship of form and space and program. So we should understand, as the Louvre was once somebody's home, so this, which will become residential and office and entertainment and convention and all sorts of observation, all sorts of uses, is being fit into a form or into a shape or into a space for which there was no original intention. And I think we could argue more and more persuasively that the form of the building has nothing to do, or very little to do, with what it accommodates, by the way. So this is Térmica in Barcelona. This would be the requisite environmental component using the tides, holding them at high tide, holding them at low tide, and then using gravity flow through turbines to produce hydroelectric energy. Which doesn't make anybody particularly virtuous, I should say. And a slightly more recent rendition of that. So I want to give you a new theory of urbanism. Not so much what it is, but why it is. So the sky and the earth and the sea, no limits, no boundaries. And the city, the advent of the city, on the left, what I call the city of instinct, in the middle, what I call the city of method or system, and on the right, what I call the city of redundancies. And I think the point, the psychotherapeutic point, is not that cities are made for trade or cities are made for defense or all the arguments. Those come after. I think cities are made by us to give our lives a story, and we develop our lives in the context of the city. That's where it happens. But it has no intrinsic meaning. It's the way we've provided limits where there are no limits, or minutes where there are no hours. So the meaning of the city, as I explain it in this context, has to do, there's a psychoanalyst called Alfred Adler, who was a contemporary of Freud and of Jung, and he talked about something you may have heard of called the inferiority complex. And in that context, I think we, who are minuscule in the face of vast and limitless space, make the city to give our lives a conceptual story. Infrastructure, substantive piece of making cities. I just took this for LA since some of you know it. So the river as infrastructure, the power grid as infrastructure, the train right-of-way, and of course the freeways. And these pieces have historically been put down constructed for mechanical or tactical reasons to move the water, to move the power, to move the train, to move the automobiles, without much sensibility for the context of the city that they're subdividing, so that infrastructure is historically and consistently divisive. Another point, this is leading up to a city project. This is Jim Sterling in the Staatsgalerie and in Stuttgart. And what has always interested me about this piece is the intersection of a public life and a private life. So the red line takes you from the street above where you live through a sort of circuitous route through the museum and out to the bus stop down at the bottom of the slide. And the point would be that there are any number of incredible, fantastic, intriguing adventures in the private world, whether on a university campus or whether on the streets of a city. And the notion of integrating that public movement system with private ongoings, it seems to me, is an advocacy worth supporting. This is a project that we're at work on for the last couple of years in Nanjing. It's a wetlands south of the existing city. And there is an important history of Nanjing, like with many Chinese cities. And in particular, at least in contemporary historical terms, there's a little book, a kind of airport waiting room book called The Rape of Nanjing, where Nanjing was torn apart during and before the Second World War by the Japanese. So there is a sensibility there which certainly advocates or aspires to a new Nanjing and a remade Nanjing. And the client for this particular project belonged to the Military Institute, which is a little like Sandhurst in England or West Point in the United States, and has that particular history well in his mind. So the idea is to remake the city by adding a new series of pieces, 4 pieces on this wetland site. The way that so this is site number 1. The area is about 26 kilometers, the gross area on a side, so essentially a square, 26 kilometers. And the way it was done was not the way one runs into, certainly in the United States, planning and zoning studies with colors and maps and done two-dimensionally. In fact, in some ways, the buildings were done before there was a site and before there was a topography. So the buildings are conceptually typological, I would say. They're spatial and formal. And they're also topological, they're organizational. And the strategy is to make types, which are typo and topo, and then accommodate those to the topography of the site. So in a sense, it's like having an alphabet and not yet having the words. And we make the alphabet first, and then we apply it. At the rear of there are 2 key portions to the site. One, the wetlands, and 2, this mountainous area. And I'm going to flip through these pretty quickly, but so this is site number 1, dimension of about 6-7 kilometers this way. All of the sites are connected by canals using existing waterways where we can, or trams. There's a tram which connects the sites, or a road system which is happenstance of what exists and what we have to add to accommodate it. Over here, there was a lake. We've added to it to enlarge it so it accommodates the floodplain, and then made islands. So these are man-made, can I say man-made, human-made islands here for this portion of the site, and then the mountain developed, and the rest of the site left as it is. And I just whoa, just to go through this. So this is, these are typologies that we developed. The original island, this is called a sun court, building of large scale, oriented and developed around the sun. This is a stacked island, which accommodates fingers that connect to other islands and perspective towers. This piece over here is on the mountain or the hillside, which steps to accommodate the topography and so on. So the lake site, the mountain site. This is the second site. Second site was done, and now I refer back to the to the infrastructure discussion. That infrastructure here becomes cohesive, not divisive, and the building is the infrastructure, and the infrastructure is the building, so that an east-west road, which divides here, this is essentially the building, and a north-south road meet as a structure of bridges, which include then all of the accoutrements or all of the aspect of life, of living, of working, of entertainment, public and private events associated with the water on that bridge, and the rest of the site essentially left, and the left as it is naturally. So the towers, and these are towers which twist to the sun, face the wind, the support system. Nothing is only what it is. So the rule, if there's a rule, is that every piece has a number of meanings, multiple meanings, not single meanings, particularly in terms of the infrastructure. This is a photovoltaic structure wrapped around the bridge, which is the entry bridge to the site. So it accommodates automobiles, it has a structure, and it holds photovoltaics and so on. The third site takes on the topic of the superblock, which we all know and have heard of and discoursed a number of years, going back to the Athens Charter and Team 10. And the superblock means simply that the gridded city, the small gridded city, is an anachronism, and the grid is eliminated, and a substantially larger structure accommodates the small pieces that heretofore belong to the grid. And this is an existing roadway. It actually runs north and south, which is developed as a high-density area with green over, in, and around the road. And then as we move east and west, the structure varies and dissipates and ultimately becomes what essentially is a rural structure. And then again, the archetypes, this is both an office and a residential structure. This is a dam, which accommodates residential and also a road. This is an organization for housing in wetlands, and so on and so on. And this is the final one, which was called the mountain or the citadel city, a hill or a mountain with essentially a plateau on top, with a perimeter now developed of city wall, with gates, with a campus on the top, and a series of cisterns. So this is really a sequence of water flow. Water is collected at the top of the hill, pumped to the city gates, dropped through the city gates by gravity through turbines producing hydroelectric power to tributaries and then to reservoirs which exist. So the chronology is largely a chronology of water. And again, the prototypes, the city wall and the city gate and the waterfall and so on. This is a project many of you know in the area, central area of Los Angeles and Culver City. And I think what I prized most over the years about working on this is that, and in some ways it could be called this nothing or something or nothing to something, but it began as a project where there was very little of value, which is not to disparage the local residents or whatever they were doing there, but simply the value of the area or the meaning of the area as architecture, as an experimental zone, or in the end, as the aggregate of a number of pieces of architecture over time was not part of the process. It was nothing and nowhere, and it became, I think, something somewhat different. And in terms of the archetype discussion, so this was the original version that led to what we're doing in Nanjing with the horticulture and the curtain and the stilts and, of course, the anomalies and so on. This is the site, this area in Culver City, subdivided by, euphemistically, the LA River, and then a second zone, which we call the Los Angeles project. The first phase of that project is shown here to identify it next to what is now the Expo line here and the river, Jefferson Boulevard, and across the top, La Cienega. And this was the first building that was built there, I think historically of some consequence, in an area that had known riots in the 1960s and the 1990s. This was the first new building that was built, certainly in a long period of time, that was done for Cineon Kodak in their headquarters. And subsequently, and we're now at work on this, which is a new chronology, the existing roughly 100 meters long, the original Kodak building, and then the beginnings of a roof garden, and then the intervention in this new building, existing building, owned by the same owner. And then the insertion of a series of roughly 10,000 square foot components for small companies or startup companies, and then the connections between those pieces. And then what we call the Narcissus project, which is organizationally a second phase of the original Kodak project. And then the towers you see here, and in the aggregate, the solution that we're at work on at the moment. This is the second site where we've been at work on a tower project, which originated, these studies, this is an exhibition at the Wexner called The Dancing Bleachers. And I think that discussion had to do with an exchange with the architect, whose name I can't remember. But at the Wexner, where the grid is the priority, the grid, the bent grid, the folded grid, but always the grid, and we introduced, this is Eisenman's project, and we introduced the dancing bleachers and the curved line. So in the abstract, it really has to do with the curve versus the straight line. And the curve has portents, whether it delivers it or not, portents of a center. So the possibility of a center, the center doesn't hold, and so on. Nevertheless, the prospect of a center with a curved line, which doesn't exist with the grid. So this was the dancing bleachers, and then this exhibition we did here, and then the hanging of that piece in the MAC in Vienna. This was the original scheme produced in 1999, 2000, and then the introduction of what I would call the form language of the circle as it meets the block. The tower, which is we're currently working on, which is a fascinating story for us, This is a building that can't be permitted according to the building code in the city of Los Angeles. So essentially we have to invent our own code, which runs through a process called peer review. So we have to make a case with the engineers and the architects and so on, and hired consultants, that a building essentially with no columns and no beams conforms to an a priori series of code requirements, which will allow us to build a building, and I think we're about now to get there. Just in terms of there are 3 different floor heights that we're building: a 24-foot floor, a 16.6 floor, and a 13.6 floor. There have been a whole series of investigations. It's steel and concrete. It's only steel. The perimeter is the core. The interior is the core. Essentially, the way it operates is that these pieces, which we call the ribbons, and circumnavigate the form and land at different points on the elevation, are now connected across in the short direction, connected by girders, which in turn support these girders and these beams, and that's the way the building will stand. Yeah, so it's come to this, has it? So this is the finite element analysis by the structural engineers, and it turns out now that the building, for a whole series of reasons having to do both with efficiencies and costs and lateral loading issues, will be on isolators. Some of you know that discussion. Essentially, the isolators are separating the ground or the ground and the below ground from the building and the building above ground. So it looks like the pro forma includes isolators now, and we're going forward to that, and it looks like it's all gonna work. We hope. This is part of it, actually. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about tension, and if you talk to your psychologist, they'll probably tell you to find a way to eliminate the aforementioned tension. And it seems like if we don't look for it by intention, we find it, and then to dwell in it and to work in it is both difficult and exhilarating. And we're trying to figure out how to do this and how to implement it. So it's a conceptual model, and then it's a technical model, and then it's a political model, and it has to operate in all of those venues. And the tension between, can we do it, will we do it? I mean, you're looking at something that's 15 years old. We'll do it. This is the iconography, and I put up in a Brancusi and the Shukov Tower, which is fantastic in Moscow, and something that I've admired for years. But I was just reading this afternoon, and I wanted to mention this because I think God did us all a disservice, whether that's sacrilege or not, because I read the story of the Tower of Babel, because I wanted to trace the aspiration to scrape the sky as far back as I could. And the Tower of Babel was apparently, when everybody spoke the same language, and was constructed and was built successfully. Did you know that? So it was built successfully, and God got a little bit irritated, according to the story, because if people were able to do this and to do it successfully, God knows what they would do. They could do anything. So God got a little concerned and defoliated the project and so on. And we've been aspiring to join or to rejoin the Tower of Babel ever since. That's the end of the story. This is the, I don't know, did I miss it? There's a site number 3 in here, which is to the south and west that we're now working on, which belongs to the same owner So this is, again, the river and Jefferson Boulevard, and this is the site, and over here is the Kodak project. Go, man. Then you follow the chronology on the left. Essentially what it is the interworking of three structures: a base building, which has very large floors, retail and office space, a garage structure underneath, and the second office tower in the area on the site. And a theater with about 450 seats. Cores, structure. So this is a new project, and we're getting ready to present this to an entitlement submittal in the next few weeks. So this is Eric Mendelsohn in the trenches of Verdun in 1917. And I've probably already covered this at some level, but I wanted to say something about the interrelationship between a sketch or a concept and the implementation of the sketch. And if you know something of the history of the Einstein Tower in Potsdam, it was built by piling up bricks and then plastering the building. So this, in my rendition, wouldn't be so much an understanding of how to build it as it would be the building of an image, which is not what we want to do. And these are examples, I think, of that exploratory discussion that belongs both to a conceptual sketch and an idea, as in Mendelssohn's project, and the technical implementation of that idea, which doesn't always succeed immediately. But that's part of the interrogatory that belongs to investigatory architecture. So this has to do with bending glass, and this has to do with using water pipes as concrete forms, and this has to do with spraying fiberglass on the exterior of buildings. I like this project especially because nobody knows what the hell it is. In a way, a building, what is it? How did you do that with no program? It's come to be known as the Art Tower, and you can see the excavation, the original excavation, and the development of it essentially as a piece of iconography that represents an area, although it's fair to say it probably wouldn't have been done without the advent of the Expo line. This is another project. You'll think it's two buildings, but two buildings actually that are one, notwithstanding the fact that they're not connected. Starts with the original existing tower, which is a steel frame that held an old industrial press. This was an early scheme, but I show it only because this is the residual consequence of that industrial press. This goes back to about 1993. And then this is the contemporary version, which will turn out to be, of all things, a very high-end restaurant. But what I mean and what I'm saying is this is one project. The height is the same. The plan dimension is the same. So the discourse or the dialogue is between these two typologies. Like the little lemon rind project that I showed initially, the conceptual model is a curve, but the translation of the curve is into pieces that are asymptotic to the curve, essentially orthogonal. So that where the curve is tighter or steeper, the horizontal dimension of the grid increases, and where it enlarges, the grid, the grid widens. And these are the legs, which essentially were done to conform to the configuration of the exterior, not the other way around. So the shape was developed, and the shape was confirmed. And then the columns and the corners are analogous, although not identical, to those shapes. This is also of interest, by the way, that the beam flanges intersected the column, and the way that was designed, there were actually plates very carefully drawn and shop drawn and reviewed and so on and so on. There are plates internal to the columns that sustain the forces in the flanges as the flanges meet the columns, except for the fact that when we X-rayed the columns, the plates were here instead of here. And I guess the can you dance discussion has now to do with how do you accommodate what was a mistake. And the way we did that was adding these plates, as you see. So this is, let's say, where it is. This is where it should have been. And plates were added after long discussions and consideration of other options, which seems to me, again, to be part of that process of thinking and rethinking in order to make it operationally intelligible, because in the end, science, as we said with Phobos, is not always science either. This is a project that we're at work on now, which is both parking and retail, or retail and office. And it originated in this discussion, which you've seen before, the Seurat process, and the points, a conservative, an extremely conservative painting in a sociological way, everyone lined up and behaving on the banks of the Seine, but with a very radical technique, the surface of points, which led to this, which was the Smithsonian competition that must go back about 8 or 9 years, which we thought we had won, but was in the end given to a British lord. And so this is the current version, which is somewhat smaller. What distinguishes this, I think, and part of it is wonder, I think, for me. That may be an element that I left out in the original discussion about knowing or not knowing, or I'm the enemy, or am I the enemy, that the quality of wonder sometimes disappears over time. And glass, and what glass is as a transparency and an ethereal quality that almost isn't there. And the magic of this is that the glass tubes, as in the Smithsonian, as in this project, are structural elements, among other things, so that they're vertical cords in a truss, in compression, which holds up the roof. So the wonder of that and the magic of that, and I guess the capacity to continue to be astonished, I'm surprised it will stand, and apparently it will. So this is the interior of that space. The intersection of the structure coming from the garage up, and then what is the structure of the retail and office space. And then this is I think this is the last project. This is the Culver City area, and a project that we've been at work on for about 15 years. This is the original site area with a number of extant buildings. And then the next step is these pieces, which are retained, so retained, these go away. And then the elements which are added over here. And then looking west and looking east. This is again a project that we worked on for about 12 years. We built a garage which holds about 650 cars, and ran the structure up, and the structure sat there rusting for about 12 years. But finally, and this is the building on the street, and then the entrance to the site, and then movement through the site, and there are the columns rusting for these many years, and the original studies for the pterodactyl project and the original model study for the project. It's an office building of about 20,000 square feet on 2 floors, which hangs over the entrance to the garage, as you see here. The first floor being open, and the second floor originally designed to privatize spaces which didn't lend themselves to open office space, a conference space and a media space and cafeteria space and so on and so on. And we built it finally after 12 years, I'm happy to say. It's the east elevation, the west elevation. The building is subdivided in the north-south direction by a bridge, which organizes the space actually in a very conventional, not to say conservative way. And the smaller spaces, which are to the west, are used for offices and private work, and the larger spaces to the east, more open and collective space. Midnight at the Oasis. In case you can't find a reference that will provide your foundation, intellectual and existential, my recommendation is to invent your own, make your own. We're doing another one now. I'll believe it when I see it, which means prove it to me and then I'll go along with you. Or this book, in this case, I'll see it when I believe it, means I believe it and I'll make it so. This we're doing with Rizzoli and AADCU in China. And finally, 100 years apart and contemporaneous. Thank you very much.